There is a moment in this story that I keep coming back to, and it has nothing to do with the spacecraft. It is a small room in a county sheriff's office in Mississippi, late on a Thursday night. Two men are sitting in it. One is 42, a shipyard foreman with a Purple Heart from Korea. The other is 19 and has been at his new job for 11 days. The sheriff has just excused himself. He has told them to wait. He has closed the door, and he has left a tape recorder running because he is certain these two men are lying to him, and he wants to catch them at it. That is not a story. That is a police technique, and it worked on people all over Jackson County for years. You take the suspects, you separate them from the deputies, you give them privacy, and privacy is where liars go to fix their story. The tape ran for about half an hour. What is on it is two men who believe nobody is listening. The older one is trying to hold the younger one together. The younger one is asking to go to a hospital because he thinks something is wrong with him and he wants something for his nerves. At one point, he asks to be left alone so he can pray. There is no rehearsal on that tape. There is no laughing. There is no version of the phrase, "stick to what we said." Sheriff Fred Diamond listened to it, and the next day he stood in front of the press and told them he believed these men. Now, let me tell you what they had come in to report. They said they had been fishing beside the Pascagoula River in the shadow of a shipyard when something came down out of the sky behind them. They said it made a sound like air escaping. They said an opening appeared in the side of it with no seam and no hinge, and three figures came out and did not walk but floated. They said those figures took hold of them and that where they were touched, they went numb. They said they were carried into a lit room inside the thing. The 19-year-old passed out at the moment of contact and would not be able to account for what happened next for another 45 years. And then, maybe 20 minutes later, they were put back on the riverbank with their fishing rods still lying where they had dropped them. This is the case that a historical marker in Pascagoula now calls America's best documented case of alien abduction. Two witnesses, a police report the same night, a secret tape, 50 phone calls to the police department from other people in the area that same evening about lights in the sky, and two men who spent the rest of their lives paying for the 20 minutes they could not explain. I want to give you the description before anything else, because it is the strangest part of this whole case, and it is strange in a way that people almost never notice. Here is what Charles Hickson described within hours to a county sheriff who did not believe him. About 5 feet tall, skin that was pale gray and wrinkled. The word he kept using was wrinkled, like something that had dried. No neck to speak of. The head sat directly on the shoulders, where the face should have been. Almost nothing. No eyes that he could see. A slit where a mouth would go, and no expression on it at all. And then the detail that has never fit anywhere. 3 carrot-shaped protrusions coming off the head, one where each ear would be, one where the nose would be. The arms ended in something he could only describe as claws, not hands. Pincers like a crab or a lobster, which is the description that followed this case into every newspaper in America the following week. And the legs did not work. They were fused or stiff or simply not used, because the things did not walk. They floated a few inches off the ground and moved as a unit, in a way both men described as mechanical, like something being operated rather than something alive. Now here is why that matters, and I need you to hold on to it, because it is the single strongest argument in this entire case, and it costs nothing to verify. October 1973 is before the gray alien, before the huge black eyes and the smooth gray skull that every person listening to me can picture right now without trying. That image did not become the standard until the late 1980s. In 1973, there was almost nothing in American culture for a 42-year-old shipyard foreman in Mississippi to copy, and what he described is not it. It does not match the archetype that was coming. It does not match the hills. It does not match anything from the movies. He described something with no eyes, a crab's claw, and vegetables growing out of its head. If you are inventing a story to be believed, you do not invent that. You invent something people will recognize. The uselessness of this description, the sheer awkwardness of it, is the thing that has kept researchers on this case for 50 years. Later investigators made the same observation. The entities at Pascagoula do not fit the type that came afterwards, which means the men were either describing something they saw or inventing something that was, from a storytelling point of view, an extraordinarily bad idea. So, who were they? Charles Hickson was 42 years old, a foreman at the shipyard, married, a veteran of Korea, wounded there, decorated for it. He had lived in that part of Mississippi most of his life, and he had a reputation in it, which is the sort of thing that matters in a town where the same families have worked the same yard for 3 generations. Calvin Parker was 19. He had grown up in Jones County, come down to the coast for work, and started at the shipyard 11 days before this happened. He was the new kid. He had a job he wanted to keep. They went fishing after work on a Thursday evening on the bank of the river near the shipyard. Nothing about that evening was supposed to be memorable. There is a detail I find almost unbearable in hindsight. They were not even catching much. Understand what these 2 men had to lose, because the arithmetic of that is the whole case. Hickson had a foreman's position, a wife, a name in a small town, and a war record. Parker had 11 days of employment and no reputation at all yet. Neither of them stood to gain one thing from what they did next. And what they did next is the part that gets skipped in every retelling. They did not go to the newspaper first. Well, they tried. They drove to the local paper's office and found it closed for the night. Before that, they had telephoned Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi. Read that again. 2 frightened men in a pickup truck on a Thursday night, calling a military installation to report what they had just experienced. Not selling it, reporting it, the way you would report a downed power line. The Air Force told them it was not their department and to call the local sheriff. There is a bleak joke buried in that, and we will come back to it, because 1973 is a very specific year for the United States Air Force to say that sentence to 2 civilians. So the newspaper was shut, and the Air Force did not want it, and they were left with the last door on the list. Shortly after 10:30 that night, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker walked into the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. They brought their fish with them. The catfish they had caught, still in the bucket, carried into a sheriff's office at 10:30 at night, as if the fish somehow proved they had really been out there doing an ordinary thing when the extraordinary thing happened. I think about that bucket a lot. Nobody planning a hoax brings a bucket of catfish. Reconstruction from what the 2 men described that night. It is around 9 in the evening. The river is black and moving slowly. Across the water, the shipyard is lit, because a shipyard is always lit, and the light lies on the surface in long, broken lines. It is October in Mississippi, which means it is still warm and the air is heavy and there are insects in it. 2 men are fishing off an old pier. They are not talking much. The younger one is tired. He has been at work since morning. And then there is a sound behind them. Both of them described it the same way. Not a roar and not an engine, but a hiss, air escaping, steam out of a pipe. Whatever it was, it came from the direction of the bank, which is the wrong direction for anything to come from. They turned around. What they said was there was an object, oval, hanging just above the ground, 30 to 40 feet across, 8 to 10 feet high, with 2 blue lights on it flashing, close. Not on the horizon, not a light in the sky, close enough that a man could throw a stone at it. And then an opening appeared, not a door that swung, not a hatch that lifted. Hickson was specific about this and stayed specific about it for the rest of his life. The opening simply became, in a surface that had had no seam, a moment earlier. 3 figures came out of it and did not touch the ground. Now everything happens very fast, and both men lose part of it. Parker, 19 years old, 11 days into a job, standing on a riverbank in the dark, looks at the things coming towards him, and his body shuts down. he faints. Everything he would later say about what happened on board came from hypnosis sessions years afterwards, and I will be straight with you about what that is worth when we get to the skeptics, because it is worth considerably less than people want it to be. Hickson stays conscious. He said 2 of the figures took him by the arms, and that at the point of contact, everything below his neck went numb, not paralyzed by fear, numb the way an arm goes when you have slept on it. And then he was off the ground, being carried, and the riverbank was going away underneath him. Here is the detail that stops me every time. Their fishing rods stayed where they fell. When the men came back, and they say it was 15, 20 minutes, no more, the rods were lying on the pier exactly where they had been dropped. Nothing had been arranged. Nothing had been staged. 2 men, one of them in his 40s with a war behind him, do not walk away from a hoax, leaving their own equipment lying in the dirt. They pick it up. That is what people do, unless they are not thinking about their equipment at all. Reconstruction from Hickson's testimony. He is inside something. The room is bright, brightly lit, with no source he can identify. The light seeming to come from everywhere, and nothing casting the shadow it should. He cannot move. He is not tied down. He is simply not in command of his body, and he can feel that his body is not where he put it. He described being held in the air, off the floor, at an angle, and then something comes to look at him. Not one of the figures, an object. He described it as an eye, a free-floating thing, roughly the shape and size of a large eye, that moved on its own through the air and traveled slowly over the length of his body, and stopped, and moved, and stopped again. Nobody was holding it. Nothing was attached to it. That is the moment I would put on the thumbnail if this were a different kind of channel. And it is also the moment where I want to be careful with you, because here is what Hickson said he felt while that thing went over him, and he said it consistently for 38 years. He was certain he was going to die. Not pain. He never claimed pain. He claimed the specific animal certainty that he was not going to be given back. And the other thing he said, over and over, is that there was no communication. Nothing spoke to him. Nothing explained. There was no message for humanity, no warning about our weapons, no invitation. The figures did not react to him at all. He said it was like being handled by something that had no interest in him whatsoever, the way you might handle a fish. Then it stopped. He was moved again, and he was back down at the water's edge, standing up, with his legs not working properly underneath him. Calvin Parker was on the ground a few feet away, and Hickson could not immediately get him to respond. That detail is on the tape later. The older man describing how hard it had been to bring the younger one round. Above them, the object was there, and then, both men said, it was gone. Not flying away, gone. They got into the truck. Hickson had whiskey in it, and he drank some, which he admitted to the police that night, and which cost him dearly afterwards, because it gave every skeptic in America a free explanation for the entire evening. I will deal with that honestly later. For now, sit with the sequence. A man drinks a mouthful of whiskey to steady his hands, and then drives to a public phone and calls a United States Air Force base to report what just happened to him. Nobody in the history of hoaxes has ever called the Air Force first. Sheriff Fred Diamond did not believe a word of it. Read his position fairly, because it is the correct position for a police officer to hold. 2 men walk in late on a weeknight with a story about creatures with claws. One of them admits he has been drinking. There is no craft, no wreckage, no photograph, and no third party. Standing where Diamond stood that night, you would think hoax too. He had his deputies check them for alcohol. Captain Glenn Ryder was there with him. They took the men into an interview room and got the story on the record, and this happened fast, within an hour or 2 of the event itself, which by the standards of this entire subject is almost unheard of. Most testimony in the UFO literature is decades old by the time anyone writes it down. This was hot. Hickson did most of the talking. Parker confirmed, and by every account was in a bad state throughout. And then Diamond ran the oldest trick in county policing. He told them to sit tight. He and Ryder walked out. He closed the door, and the recorder in that room kept running. I want you to understand exactly what he expected, because it tells you what he believed. He expected a pair of suspects with the door shut to do what liars do: drop the act, check each other, agree on the details, laugh. He had used this on real cases. It works, because it almost always works. Reconstruction, based on what is on the recording. For roughly half an hour, two men sit in a room they believe is private, and they do not check their story once. The older one talks the younger one down. The younger one is coming apart. He wants to go home, or he wants a hospital, because he thinks he needs something for his nerves. He says he does not want to be here. He asks, at one point, to be left by himself so he can pray. There is nothing on that tape that a liar would say to another liar. And this is the part that should have ended the argument 50 years ago. There is also nothing on it that either of them was performing for. They had no reason on earth to believe they were being heard. Diamond came back and listened to it. And then, Fred Diamond, a hard old county sheriff who had gone into that night looking for the hoax, went out the next day and told the press he believed them. Then the story went to the wire services. And by the weekend, Pascagoula, Mississippi, belonged to the world. There is one more thing about that tape, and it is the reason I am telling you this case, rather than one of the 100 others like it. It survived. For decades it existed only as a thing people described. Then, around the start of the pandemic, copies of the sheriff's office recording surfaced, brought to Calvin Parker personally at his house by a man who said he had been an officer with the Pascagoula Police Department that night and who did not want his name used. He said that on the night of the 11th, his department fielded roughly 50 calls from people reporting something in the sky. So this is not a case where the evidence disappeared and the trail went cold and everybody who touched the file conveniently died. This is a case where the evidence turned up on the witness's doorstep 47 years later. For 45 years, the case rested on two men. That is the standard objection to Pascagoula, and it is a reasonable one. Two witnesses, a shared experience, a shared incentive to hold the line. Everything else, the tape, the sheriff, the press, is downstream of those two men agreeing with each other. And then, in 2018, Calvin Parker finally published his account. And the thing that happened next is the part of this story nobody expected. Other people started coming forward. A woman named Maria Blair said she and her husband had been across the water that night. They saw it from a car, from the far bank, while it was happening, and they said nothing at all about it for the next 4.5 decades. Another witness put his testimony on the record, saying he had been across the water too, and that he had seen not only the object, but the figures, and watched the thing leave. Sit with the arithmetic of that for a second. These are people who had a corroborating account of the most famous UFO case in the American South, living in the same region, watching two men get turned into a national joke, and choosing to say nothing about it for the next 45 years. Why would you do that? You would do it for exactly the reason you are thinking. They watched what happened to Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. They saw the press descend, the comedians, the questions about whiskey, reputations dismantled in public, and they made the entirely rational decision that this was not a thing you put your name on. That is the hidden cost of ridicule in this subject, and it almost never gets counted. It does not just punish the witnesses, it removes the corroboration. Every person who decides to keep quiet takes a piece of the evidence with them, and the case gets weaker, and the weakness is then used as proof that nothing happened. 2 weeks after the 11th of October, there was one more thing. Coast Guardsmen and fishermen reported pursuing something in the Pascagoula River itself, a metallic object with an amber light under the surface, for something like 40 minutes. I am not going to tell you what that was. I am telling you it was reported by people whose job is boats and water in the same river in the same month. The picture that emerges is not two men and a story. It is a river with a lot of people around it, most of whom decided that talking was the more dangerous option. And there is a reason the year matters here, because by that autumn, there was nobody left whose job it was to ask them. Go back to that phone call for a second, because it is the hinge of this whole story, and almost nobody notices it. Two men call an Air Force base to report an encounter, and the Air Force tells them to call the sheriff. 4 years earlier, that call would have gone somewhere. From 1948, the United States Air Force ran the investigation of these reports as official business. Project Sign, then Grudge, then Blue Book, 12,000 cases. A scientific consultant on the payroll, an astronomer named Joseph Allen Hynek, who was hired to explain reports away and did it well enough to keep the job for over 20 years. In December of 1969, the Air Force shut it down. Officially, there was nothing there worth studying. So, in October of 1973, when the strangest wave of these reports in a generation swept across the American South, there was no longer anybody whose job it was to look at them. The desk was gone. That is why a sergeant at Keesler told two terrified men to go and find a sheriff. And here is what happened in the vacuum. Civilians did it instead. A private research organization sent James Harder, an engineering professor from Berkeley, to Mississippi. And Hynek, the same Hynek, now out of uniform and working on his own, flew down to Pascagoula and interviewed the witnesses himself. Think about what that means. The man the Air Force had employed for 2 decades to make these cases go away got on a plane at his own initiative to sit down with a shipyard foreman and a 19-year-old because his old employer would not. He interviewed Sheriff Diamond too. That recording exists. 1973 is also the year Hynek founded his own center for the study of these reports because the government had left the field entirely. And Pascagoula did not happen in a quiet month. That autumn produced sighting after sighting across Mississippi, Alabama, and Ohio. The police department alone taking 50 calls in one night. So the picture is this. At the exact moment the United States decided officially that there was nothing to see, the largest wave of reports in 20 years arrived, and the only people left to write any of it down were a county sheriff with a hidden tape recorder and a handful of academics working without a budget. That is not a conspiracy. It is worse in a way. It is an absence, a place where the record simply stops being kept, and everything that happened afterwards had to be gathered by amateurs, decades late, out of shoeboxes. And the same month would produce one more case, one where the witnesses wore uniforms. 1 week after 2 shipyard workers walked into a Mississippi sheriff's office, something happened in the air over Ohio that makes Pascagoula impossible to file away as a local curiosity. At 10:30 on the night of the 18th of October, an Army Reserve helicopter lifted off from Port Columbus, bound for Cleveland, 96 nautical miles to the north-northeast. 4 men aboard. In command, Captain Lawrence Coyne, 36 years old, 19 years of flying behind him. At the controls, First Lieutenant Arrigo Jesse, 26, a chemical engineer. Behind him, Sergeant John Healy, 35, flight medic, and a serving Cleveland police officer. And the crew chief, Sergeant Robert Yanisek, 23, a computer technician. That is your witness list. A police officer, an engineer, a technician, and a career aviator, all on duty, all sober, all trained observers, all in the same aircraft. Around 11 near Mansfield, one of them noticed a red light on the horizon. They took it for a tower beacon or a wingtip light on another aircraft. Then it turned towards them and started closing. Coyne put the helicopter into a descent, 500 feet a minute, and called Mansfield Tower to ask whether the traffic was theirs. The tower answered him, acknowledged his call sign, and then the radio went dead. Every transmission after that was lost. What the crew described next is the reason this case survives. The object came to a stop in front of them and hung there. They described it as cigar-shaped, silent, filling the windshield. Then the instrument stopped making sense. Coyne had the collective down. The helicopter was configured to descend, and it was descending. And instead, the aircraft climbed up to nearly 3,800 feet, with the controls set to take it the other way. Here is the detail I cannot get past. All 4 men felt the G-forces of the dive. Not one of them felt the climb. Coyne was only faintly aware of it. It registered on the altimeter and not on their bodies. Then it was over. The light moved off towards Mansfield. Control came back, and the crew flew on to Cleveland and landed, and then had to work out how to write it up. Coyne did not go quietly through military channels. He went to the Federal Aviation Administration's Chief of Operations at Cleveland Hopkins the same night. That man later said, on the record, that he held Coyne's integrity and capability in extremely high regard. Ground witnesses were located afterwards by independent researchers, a woman and 4 teenagers, driving south from Mansfield at about 11 that night, who had stopped to watch a steady red light. The Center for UFO Studies, working through an exhaustive investigation by researcher Jenny Zeidman, came to regard this as the most credible case of the entire 1973 wave. 7 days, 2 states, 1 month. In one of them, 2 working men were laughed out of their own town. In the other, 4 uniformed servicemen filed a report and were believed, and the case became a textbook. The difference was not the evidence. It was who was doing the telling. Now, the thing that makes this case genuinely unusual, and it runs opposite to almost every story in this subject. The evidence in Pascagoula did not vanish over time. It grew. The normal shape is decay. Files get lost, witnesses die, the box goes to a landfill when somebody's mother clears the garage. And in this subject, the decay is often presented as sinister, which is convenient, because an empty shelf cannot be checked. Here the opposite happened, and it happened because people went looking. When a researcher approached Parker for his documents and photographs, there was nothing to give. His material was gone. So the search went outward instead, to newspaper morgues, to private collections, to the papers of the organization that had sent James Harder down to Mississippi in the first place. And in those files, decades later, recordings turned up. Recordings made within days of the encounter. Recordings made on the evening it happened. The hypnosis session between Parker and Harder. The actual audio, not somebody's account of it. And J. Allen Hynek interviewing Sheriff Fred Diamond directly, which means the sheriff's own assessment of those 2 men exists in his own voice. Alongside that, a researcher in Ohio conducted something like 30 fresh interviews with people connected to the case and the area, half a century after the fact. Understand what this means for how you weigh Pascagoula. You are not being asked to trust a summary written in 1975 by somebody who spoke to somebody. On the central points, the primary material exists, and unlike almost everything in this field, more of it exists now than did 20 years ago. That cuts both ways, and I want to be fair about it. Recordings held privately and released through a publisher are not the same as documents deposited in a state archive with a catalog number. Provenance matters. The audio needs authentication, dating, and independent custody, and nobody should treat a copy passed between enthusiasts as equivalent to a filed public record. But the direction of travel is the point. In 50 years, this case has not thinned out. Witnesses came forward. Tapes surfaced. A marker went up. A publisher, a docuseries, and a stack of interviews exist where there used to be 2 men and a rumor, which is exactly why the argument against it deserves to be made properly rather than shouted down. Here is where I stop, because the case against Pascagoula is not weak, and the honest version of this story includes it in full. Start with the whiskey. Hickson admitted to drinking that night. He admitted it to a sheriff, unprompted, which is not what a careful liar does, but it is there, in the record, permanently, and it gives you a complete explanation for a great deal of what follows. Then the polygraph. This is messier than either side likes to admit. Hickson took a polygraph, and it was reported as showing he was telling the truth. The aviation journalist Philip Klass, the most relentless skeptic this subject ever produced, went after the details and argued that Hickson had refused an examination by a genuinely experienced examiner and that the test he did take does not carry the weight it was given. Class concluded the whole thing was a hoax. Joe Nickel later wrote that Hickson's behavior was questionable and that his claims grew in the retelling over the years. That last point is the strongest one against this case, and it is fair. Hickson's account did change at the edges over 3 decades. He wrote a book. He went on television. Elements appeared later that were not there in 1973. Now the hypnosis, which is the biggest problem of all. Nearly everything detailed about Calvin Parker's time inside the craft came out under hypnosis, in sessions conducted over the years by a whole series of different people. And hypnosis is not a memory retrieval tool. It is, as one commenter on this subject put it recently and correctly, the point at which confabulation becomes indistinguishable from recall. Whatever comes out after the induction cannot be separated from what the subject already believed, feared, or was asked leading questions about. I'm not saying Parker lied. I am saying the hypnotic material has no evidential value, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to make the story better. So what survives all that? The whiskey does not explain the tape. A man steadying himself with a drink does not, 4 hours later, alone in a locked room with a friend, keep performing terror for an audience he does not know exists. The hypnosis does not touch the original night either. Everything I have told you about the sound, the opening with no seam, the floating figures, the numbness, the eye, that was on the record within hours, before any hypnotist was involved, and the changing story cuts both ways. Hickson embellished over 30 years and made money from a book. Calvin Parker did the opposite. He walked away. He refused to discuss it for 4.5 decades, moved away, worked, said nothing, and only wrote his own account in his 60s. If this was a hoax, it is the only one I know of where one of the 2 conspirators went silent for 4.5 decades and got nothing out of it at all. The owls of the Kentucky case had a body they never found. Here the skeptics have a much better argument, and still no explanation for the one piece of evidence that was collected while nobody was watching. The press arrived within about a day, and it did not leave. Charles Hickson became the man from the Pascagoula thing. He told it for the remainder of his years, in books and on television, and never took any of it back. He died in 2011. Calvin Parker did the other thing. He was 19. He had a job he had held for 11 days. And what happened to him was that a national story landed on a teenager from Jones County who had no equipment for it whatsoever. He stopped talking. He left the coast for years. He worked. He had a nervous breakdown. The one detail that tells you everything. When a researcher finally asked him decades later for his documents, his photographs, his cuttings from that time, Parker told him there was nothing left because Hurricane Katrina had taken all of it. That is what 45 years of not talking about something looks like. Not a locked box in a storage unit. A man who kept nothing, said nothing, and lost the little he had to a storm. He came back in 2018 and wrote his account, and the moment he did, the other witnesses we heard about earlier began to surface. People who had carried the same night in silence for the same reason he had. In June of 2019, the city put a marker up at Lighthouse Park describing what happened there. Parker went. He said that if he could be buried underneath that plaque, it would explain what it meant to him better than words would. He died of kidney cancer at home on the 24th of August, 2023, with his wife beside him. He had asked that his last written word on the subject not be published until after he was gone. So, where does this end? What is established? 2 men reported this to law enforcement within hours, before any press, any researcher, and any hypnotist touched it. The sheriff's office recorded them covertly, and the recording exists. The county sheriff, who began the night convinced it was a hoax, ended it convinced it was not. The local police department fielded dozens of public reports about the sky on the same evening. The entities described do not match the archetype that dominated the culture afterwards. Neither man was paid, protected, or believed at the time. What remains open? Whether the polygraph was worth anything, the sources genuinely conflict, and I have flagged that, which bank of the river they were on. Even that is reported differently in different accounts. And everything that came from hypnosis, which is most of what people think they know about this case, and what would close it, or at least move it. The full sheriff's office audio, properly authenticated and dated by an archive rather than passed hand to hand on copies. The original 1973 incident file from Jackson County. The police department's call log for the 11th of October, which would turn roughly 50 calls from a memory into a document, and Hynek's own recordings from that trip, including his interview with Diamond, deposited somewhere a researcher can actually reach them. None of that would tell you what was on the riverbank. It would tell you, with certainty, what two men said within an hour of it, and how many other people that night said something too. That question has an answer, and it is sitting in boxes in Mississippi. Here is what it cost them. One of them talked about it for 38 years. The other one didn't talk about it for 45. Neither of those is what a man does after making something up. Now, you are Fred Diamond. You have two men in a room. One of them smells of whiskey, and you have just switched on a recorder they don't know about, expecting to catch them. You play it back, and it is not what you expected. Do you go out in front of the cameras the next morning and say you believe them? In your county, in Mississippi, in 1973, with your name on the ballot? Tell me in the comments.